Hey. Hi. How's everybody doing tonight? My name is Franklin Sermons. I'm the director of the Perez Art Museum, Miami. Welcome. Thank you for coming out for this Deborah and Dennis Scholl lecture series. And this is the last for the series this year, and we are obviously in for a treat. I am incredibly honored to introduce my friend and the artist, Sam Durant. Sam Durant is a multimedia artist whose works engage a variety of social, political, and cultural issues. Often referencing American history, his work explores the varying relationships between culture and politics, engaging subjects as diverse as the civil rights movement, Southern rock music, and modernism. His work has been widely exhibited internationally in the United States, and he has had solo museum exhibitions at MoCA in Los Angeles, the Kunstverein für die Rhineland und Westfalen in Düsseldorf, the SMAC Ghent in Belgium, and the Govett Brewster Art Gallery in New Zealand. His work has been included in the Panama, Sydney, Venice, and Whitney biennials and Documenta. He shows with several galleries, including Blum and Poe in Los Angeles, Paula Cooper in New York, Praz de Lavalade in Paris, and Sadie Coles in London. A philosopher, scholar, and professor, Durant's work often goes outside the studio. He teaches art at the Cal Arts in Valencia, California, and his curatorial credits include Eat the Market at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and Black Panther, the Revolutionary Art of Emory Douglas at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. He has co-organized numerous group shows and artist benefits and is a co-founder of Transforma, a cultural rebuilding collective project that began in New Orleans. He was a finalist for the 2008 Hugo Boss Prize and has received a United States Artist Broad Fellowship and a City of Los Angeles Individual Artist Grant. His work can be found in many public collections, including the Tate Modern in London, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and LACMA and PAMM, where we proudly present his work at this time in the permanent collection exhibition, Global Positioning Systems. It's an incredible piece on view, and I can't wait to hear this lecture. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Franklin, for that very generous introduction, and I wanted to thank everyone here at the PAMM who's been terrific hosting my visit here, and especially Diana Nawi, who invited me here, as well as Franklin. This is my first visit, actually, to the museum, and really the first time I've stayed in the city in a long, long time. So it's been interesting seeing a little bit, reconnecting a little bit with Miami. So I think I'll just show a couple of recent projects, a couple of which are these two sort of public projects that are interesting because they, for me, I should say, hopefully they're interesting for you. Just because this project, Labyrinth, Scaffold, the other one is Labyrinth, which I did last year in Philadelphia, sort of originated in very different ways. This piece came out of a lot of research in kind of the history of the capital punishment in the United States and the relationship to contemporary issues, mass incarceration in particular, all the kinds of inequalities that you have in the ethnicities of people who are on death row and who wind up getting executed. And the piece that Franklin mentioned that's in the collection here, very happy and proud to have the work here, is a model, a preliminary model that was made leading up to this final piece here. And what you're seeing is a kind of architectural assemblage of 7 different gallows of some historic significance in the United States. So there's a bit of a kind of aspect of U.S. history being told through the particular gallows that were chosen to be reproduced in this work. And obviously, it forms a kind of viewing platform where visitors can spend some time, go up on top, walk around. These images are from the installation in Documenta in the big, it's called the Our Park, the big kind of imperial garden in the city of Kassel. And it was just installed in front of the big lake area on this sort of meeting point of all these different pathways. So it's a very interesting location in the park, and it turned out to be quite attractive for people to go up and stand on the platform and look at the park and have a view, kind of slowly discover what the structure was. Inside this you see this little sort of 2-walled house structure there. There was a small sign which sort of gave some information about what the structure was. So you have a listing of the different gallows and what they were, who was being executed, and just a little bit of explanation. The earliest one was the John Brown gallows, 1859. Another fairly early one, Mankato gallows, which was and still is the largest mass execution. If you rule out the drone strikes, I guess, technically, legally, those are not executions. Haymarket martyrs, and so there's a few from the 19th century, and then early 20th century, up to the Saddam Hussein execution, which is, which is kind of a stretch. When I was sort of conceiving the work, these are some of the images that we used to try and reconstruct the gallows. When I started conceiving the work, it was not too long after we had invaded Iraq and captured Saddam Hussein, and so I guess there was a desire to sort of connect the larger American imperial footprint, as it were, internationally to the domestic as well. So these early ones, there were no actual photographs of. So I worked with architects and an architect to kind of reconstruct them and try and scale things, and then reconstruct it all together. And after it had shown in a few places in Europe, the Walker Art Center actually acquired it, so it will be installed there in their sculpture garden, which will be interesting. I think that's going to happen this fall. And this, so that work really evolved out of my own research and my interests, and it was a very studio-based project. I made a number of models and kind of through it was a very long process of figuring that out, figuring out that work. This work, Labyrinth, which I did last year in Philadelphia, was a totally different kind of experience. This is a digital rendering of a chain link fence labyrinth structure in this plaza in Philadelphia. This is a view looking down at the plaza from the top of the tower at the City Hall in Philadelphia. Those of you that maybe have been to Philadelphia, you know this area a little bit. Just to the, on the left side is where the Love Park is. And so it's really in the downtown area. And I was invited by the Mural Arts organization in Philadelphia, which, you know, is a very successful public art project that does, obviously, murals in the city, but has also become a really important cultural and political player in the city of Philadelphia. And they do a lot of kind of social projects as well, a lot of work with incarcerated people and people coming out of prison, transitional programming, jobs training, and things like that. So they were doing an initiative about mass incarceration, inviting artists to do works to raise awareness in the city about the issue. I started working with a group of inmates at the Graterford State Prison, which is outside, an hour or so outside of the city. And they had a group of about 40 men in that prison that were a kind of art group that they've been working with. And so I went to them, and over about a period of about a year, going and visiting every month or so, we worked together to come up with this idea. I went there, I said, look, we've got this location in the middle of the city of Philadelphia that has tremendous tourism. You've got people working in all the offices, and now you've got all the government buildings there, the courthouse is there, City Hall, all the social services buildings are right there. So, you know, what could we say? What do you want to say about this issue? And one of the guys came up with this idea. It's like when you go into the criminal justice system, it's like you go into a labyrinth and you never get out. And so that was the kind of the genesis of it. Well, you know, labyrinth is a really interesting idea. It connects to Greek mythology and the idea, you know, also the kind of our democracy, which started in, you know, one of the places it started, it was Philadelphia. And that connects back to the idea of Greek, where democracy came from, the idea of the polis. And so that's how we kind of developed it. And then we talked through, well, you know, one of the things for them, and for a lot of the people that I talk to and work with, not just in the prisons, but in the jails and in the reentry programs. They have a program called the Guild, where they work with young men and women coming out of prison to get their lives together, to get jobs and things like that, to try and stay out of the system once they get out of jail. But one of the ideas was visibility, you know, and particularly for the guys who are in prison, they're socially dead. They don't exist in the world anymore, and they're not allowed to represent themselves. You know, I can't show any pictures, for instance, of the working groups in the prison there in Pennsylvania. You're not allowed to show any pictures or film or anything. So they got this idea of doing a kind of memorial kind of space, and also of trying to make visible what's kind of rendered invisible in society. And there was a series of these sort of graphics put down on the ground around the work to give it some context, some information about the issues. And And then the idea was through all this programming to invite people to contribute, in a sense, to use the fencing like a bulletin board or a gallery space or whatever. And so there was a lot of public programming and a lot of programming in the most affected communities. I mean, the communities where people are going to prison are also the communities that are suffering from the crimes being committed. So they're doubly penalized, basically. And most of the guys in prison that I met with, they themselves came from families that were already deeply traumatized by all the kinds of negative effects of poverty. And most of them really didn't have a chance, in a way, to escape the place that they wound up in would be incredibly unlikely. And many of the stories of the guys, it was, you could really relate. It's like a lot of them go into the prison when they're teenagers, and a number of the men were serving life without parole, and in Pennsylvania they have juvenile life without parole. So they went into prison when they're 16, and these are guys that are the same age as me, in their 50s, and they've been in this prison their entire lives. It was a very moving, powerful experience. This guy here made this amazing kind of spider web installation. He is formerly incarcerated and has been out for a few years, and he was really inspired and kind of moved by the whole thing. And so when he saw it, he went and planned this whole installation that he installed in the Labyrinth. So it was real interesting. This is one of the projects. This Orange Ribbon project was one of the guys in the prison who gave these ribbons to everyone on his cell block and asked them to write something on it. And then when he collected them all, we took them and hung them up on the structure. So this kind of, transparent labyrinth, it starts out transparent, and then as people are adding material, it becomes more and more opaque. So the labyrinth kind of effect doesn't, it sort of gets transformed over time by the addition of the materials on the structure. So, just in thinking about my own practice, this was maybe the first time I had worked in a completely collaborative way without really having an idea when I started the project about what was going to happen, and then really working with the different people, the different groups, and the different institutions, stakeholders, to produce this project. And I guess I would say I enjoy both ways of working. Lately, a lot of opportunities have been more in this direction. This seems to be something that institutions particularly are interested in pursuing. And, it's an interesting opportunity. Try some new ways of working, new modes of working. And then I want to show some images from a show that some of you may have seen a couple of years ago in New York at the Paula Cooper Gallery. And, I thought it might have some connections here. A big part of the show has to do with Caribbean surrealism. The invisible surrealists, in a way, the idea is kind of a revision of the history of surrealism and bringing in the lesser-known folks from the Francophone world, the former colonies, North Africa, and the Caribbean, and a little bit Southeast Asia as well. Although, according to my research, there were no Southeast Asian surrealists, and I have a friend in Singapore who's a Vietnamese historian of Vietnamese modern art, and she's been sort of doing research in that because Vietnam, obviously they had a Beaux-Arts system from France, from the French occupation. It's unclear whether there were artists there that were influenced by Surrealism. Anyway, so this was the kind of installation views of the show, and there was a lot of different things going on. This work, which is called There's No Such Thing as a Timeline, was a timeline. And sort of it started out really just as a mind map of all these things I was thinking about, very influenced by that moment in the early 20th century when Surrealism was formed in Paris, and looking back a little bit into the sort of political, social, cultural things that led up to this moment in Paris, and then looking through its main period from the early 20th century to the end of the Second World War, and then up to, well, I was thinking about it in terms of, it was a very subjective thing and kind of wide-ranging, but thinking about what, okay, if we're looking at kind of the post-colonial Francophone world, where does that extend to through the 60s and 70s? And so I kind of brought it up to 79, to that year. So many things changed in the late 70s, particularly the revolution in Iran, because of course the Middle East, the borders that we have in the Middle East were created in the wake of the First World War, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So we're still kind of reaping history in the present with all the things that are going on in the Middle East. So this drawing is based on this kind of iconic image that Man Ray made, which was in the first Surrealist journal. All the sort of founders with their eyes closed, surrounded by a Magritte nude. What are they dreaming about? One wonders. Anyway, I inserted the image of Marcel Duchamp posing as Adam. There was Man Ray did a photo shoot of Adam and Eve, and Man Ray posed as Adam. And then these are a number of sort of important underknown surrealists from outside of the Imperial Center. And another one aspect of the project was making these drawings and sort of inserting the invisible folks back into these iconic images, again, Man Ray images, and kind of questioning also the nature of the archival image itself in producing a kind of mythological history. So here you see a lot of them crowded in. Let's see, Wilfredo Lam, of course, Joyce Mansour, Egyptian, Suzanne Césaire from Martinique, Claude McKay, a Jamaican author. So there's also a combination of writers and visual artists as well. Another image. This is from a Man Ray photo again of called the Seance, and the figure here, that's the only figure that's added in here, is an image of Frantz Fanon, who rather than looking down at the supernatural phenomenon, he's staring directly at the viewer. Fanon is often attributed as a kind of founder theorist of post-colonial positioning and the founder of post-colonial studies, or what would become post-colonial studies. His two books are very important to the field. He was from Martinique, trained as a doctor and became a psychiatrist in Paris, and then during the Algerian War for Independence, he went and took over the main mental hospital in Algiers and became the director of that institution and supported the resistance movement of the Algerian nationalist movement that eventually succeeded in gaining independence from France. So he's a very important person. He knew Aimé Césaire, the poet, surrealist poet from Martinique. Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, for me, were so important because the Césaires really joined the political and the artistic in such an important way. I mean, Césaire ended up going back to Martinique and was the mayor of Fort-de-France for like 20 years, member of the Communist Party. You know, try not to hold that against him. It was a different time, of course, then. But to imagine a poet and a surrealist poet at that, being the mayor of a city is kind of amazing. This is an image where I didn't add or change anything. So there was kind of a mix of images that were kind of faithful reproductions to the originals combined with these obviously manipulated ones. This is when the Bretons traveled to Haiti and Dominican Republic, went all through the Caribbean in the mid-40s, you know, during the war. I mean, there's an interesting story that Breton did some lectures in Haiti in 45 and 46, just when there was a kind of uprising, a revolution that a lot of people wrongly, or you know, maybe not wrongly, but there's a lot of stories that Breton really incited this revolution in 1945 after one of his speeches kind of denouncing imperialism, you know, after the war, it ended saying, well, the war's over, but imperialism's not over. And there was a local newspaper that took the story up, and eventually there was a general strike, and the president at the time, who was backed by the U.S., was overthrown, or he stepped down, leading to the, you know, a kind of a brief period of democracy in Haiti. And it was another kind of moment when, again, when the kind of art and politics came together in an interesting way, producing a kind of historical effect. This one is sort of, you know, the idea of modernism, European rationalism, Cartesian philosophy, the kind of different lineups, different ordering systems. You know, here it's this is children in a French school in Bakuya. They don't look very happy. This was a kind of amazing image. Troops of the Eight-Nation Alliance in 1900. So obviously in order of importance, left to right, you've got a British soldier, an American US soldier, an Australian, British India, Germany, France, Austro-Hungarian, Italian, and then Japan at the end. Japan's very short-lived on that list. And then these are British soldiers coming back from the battlefields in Europe, blinded by all the mustard gas and nerve agents and stuff that were being used in the trenches. Sigmund Freud's desk, kind of lineup of figures. And of course, Freud and psychoanalysis was so important to the Surrealists. The whole idea of an unconscious was brand new at that time. And here the Surrealists, this is a interesting image. I mean, I've seen this image reproduced so often, and I never knew that it had been cropped and sort of manipulated to block out the image of the church in the background, of Notre Dame in the background. I found this full frame image that hadn't been retouched. And it's kind of a interesting, it just tells you so much about how these images and how history is kind of constructed in the cropping, and the kind of what's cropped out of that frame is so important. And the war, of course, the First World War, where that whole notion of a sort of a singular self, an understanding of the world, all these kinds of 19th century ideas were just, completely shattered, literally shattered by the sort of industrial warfare during the First World War. This is an image of the trenches in Verdun. And another aspect of the project was looking at trench art, which is it didn't begin in the First World War, but that's where it was sort of codified. These guys sitting in trenches for weeks and weeks and weeks, and making little sculptures and trinkets and things out of war material. Kind of maybe a little bit of a sculpture or a monument. This is a celebration of Armistice Day in 1918 in the Place de la Concorde. This kind of spontaneous piling up of armaments around the existing monument. The kind of irony there. The Treaty of Versailles, and the Paris Peace Conference. You see the women fixing the rugs in the palace, and then the three leaders of Germany, France, and Britain. U.S., France, and Britain. Woodrow Wilson, Churchill, and Clemenceau, thank you, yeah. So this is an image from 1916 in Breton, when he was a young man, served, this is him here, in a mental hospital for soldiers suffering from shell shock. And this is where he met with the psychiatrists or psychologists who were working with Charcot and developing, the first ideas of, in a sense, of what mental health was, what emotions were, and the effects that the war was having on people who had never been seen before. So shell shock was something that no one knew what it was. It had never existed. And through that, Breton became acquainted with Freud. And in a way, maybe this was the starting point of Surrealism, or a particular point. It wasn't really the starting point, but a moment, an important moment in the connection between psychoanalysis and Surrealism. This is a kind of assemblage work of different examples of trench art, kind of combined into this, very sort of modernist convention of exhibiting small objects, kind of museological convention. So like this one here is from the First World War, a vase made out of a copper shell casing, and then there are different other conflicts. This is from the Vietnam War, World War II, this crazy lamp also from World War II. So there are just kind of a number of different things from different conflicts in the 20th century. And then this work, which maybe bringing the whole idea of trench art and into the 21st century. This was a mobile wind chime that I constructed using. These are shell casings from the war in Iraq, and then just using kind of surrealist conventions or motifs to make this kind of bell out of it, rendering the armaments into kind of aesthetic production. Some more drawings. This is Suzanne Césaire. This is probably recognize most of these guys. Breton, Diego Rivera, Leon Trotsky, and Jacqueline Breton. Another kind of, what I found an interesting image, that this image I've seen reproduced quite a lot, and I never had seen this one before. And again, this idea of the cropping, or which image you use out of a whole roll of film. That was they're very different. They say very different things, the two images. This is an image of Egyptian poet named Joyce Mansour, who was quite important to Breton and the other surrealists as well. And her first book was called Screams, and it was very erotic, very explicitly erotic, in a way that the surrealist writers hadn't been. Things were much more symbolic to that point, and she really opened the door, in a way, for a lot of the poets, in terms of being more explicit in the writing, more sexually explicit. I think this image is amazing, with her holding the cigar. This is Jane Cortez, African-American poet, surrealist poet. And she's another one. I think she's very underknown. And, I was wondering about connecting also to North America. And, of course, surrealism came into North America during the war period and before the war period, but many of the people escaping Europe coming into the U.S. I think she's a interesting, underknown person here who was very influenced by what was going on in the surrealist movement. And then this is, again, the top image is a Canadian surrealist performer named Jean Benoit, who was very involved in the '68, in the events leading up to '68 in Paris, May '68. And this is an early performance dedicated to Marquis de Sade on the top, and then on the bottom images is looking up the staircase in Freud's house in Vienna. I think that image was taken just after Freud had left, just after the Anschluss. And, this image from the cover of a catalog of an art show, again, kind of looking at a moment when art and politics came together. This was the Lautréamont quote, poetry must be made by all, which was an important surrealist predecessor, He was a very important writer for them. And this show included, kind of political expressions along with the Surrealists and the Russian constructivist movement. You had the Black Panthers were in the show. A lot of the work by the Atelier Populaire, which was just happening at the moment in Paris, and things like that all brought together into one show. Pontus Hultén, the great Pontus Hultén, put the show together. And this one, which is a last project I'll talk about, which was just in Tokyo, in December. And the gallery I work with in Los Angeles, Blum & Poe, they opened a space in Tokyo. And so I was interested in this connection between the United States and Japan, and particularly around the area of commerce. And so I was thinking about Admiral or Commodore Perry and his expedition to Edo, to Tokyo, in the 1850s, and basically going into Tokyo Bay and forcing Japan, which had been closed to foreign trade, open, and negotiating a very favorable trade agreement with the United States. And those of you that know this history, those to this day that they're known as the Black Ships, and that's what they call the Blum & Poe Gallery in Tokyo, the Black Ship. And it's still very difficult for foreigners to do business in Japan. So I thought it was an interesting. It was, an interesting connection for me, and especially in the moment when Japanese nationalism is on the rise and there's sort of a lot of things going on. The first time we're talking about some changes since the Second World War in terms of relations, inter-Asian relations, but also between the U.S. and Japan. This is a hokusai woodblock print that was very popular in the early 20th century when Japan defeated the Russian army in a battle over this map here you see depicting the Russo-Japanese War, the battle over the Korean Peninsula, which to that point had been controlled by Russia. Japanese actually beat the Russians and took possession. And it was a very important moment, 1903, I think, in world history, because it was the first time in the imperial era when an Asian country had defeated a European imperial power. And it inspired people from all over the Middle East and Asia in a way that, according to Tagore, the Indian writer and poet, this was a incredibly important moment that really began the struggle for Indian independence. Anyway, war is always depicted in the most, violent and grotesque ways, I guess, is the point. Another interesting thing is this treaty between Russia and Japan was negotiated in the United States and in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, actually. And then I kind of did a number of different drawings, kind of comparing Japanese sort of typologies of Japanese illustration with American, Euro-American modes. This one is kind of, again, these hokusai woodblock print. This is the hand, the American hand reaching into Japan, the opening of the markets to the world, the opening of Japan to the world. And some people are recoiling in fear, some are willing to engage kind of displays the ambivalence one might feel, that I think we can all relate to that. A drawing of kind of using images of bridges in traditional garden landscape architecture, kind of making one long bridge out of all of these different kind of compiling together. Thinking about the way, the different ways that we construct narratives, or my understanding, my very limited understanding of the way Japanese traditional work constructs narratives versus my rather much more conversant relationship to the way we do it here in the US and the European tradition. Anyway, these are a series of prints, kind of scroll-like prints, where I found images of the voyage, of Perry's voyage. He brought an artist with him, and the artist made illustrations of all the things that happened in this trip. And then I found images of the same events done by Japanese illustrators or artists, and then just put them together. So you have these kind of series of dyads, depictions of the same scenes from different viewpoints. And there were just several different comparisons. There was this was an important moment technologically for Japan as well, like the introduction of the locomotive. Here you see a Japanese image of it. And here the American image. It's you can't see from the slides. I apologize, I don't have any details. But so it was not, let's say, and I guess there's not a complete rejection of this historical moment in Japan. In fact, the Japanese, in some ways, I guess I would say they feel ambivalent about it from what I was able to understand. I mean, they were able to see that they got a lot out of this, even though this initial situation was not something that they wanted. At least the shogunate, the rulers there didn't want it. But I think in Japanese society, there were so many benefits to this opening of market and trades and the exchange of technology. I'm not in any way familiar with Japanese history or culture, so I wasn't really sure what the reaction would be. And it was quite interesting. I mean, there's a museum to this whole thing still existing, and also, I guess the perspective from the Japanese point of view is that we are an equal power to the United States. They don't look at the United States as a superior power. We're equal players. And so they don't see it so much as a conquest, as much as a kind of something that was mutually beneficial, or at least significantly beneficial from their side. There's an interesting image too. I mean, the introduction of the camera and image making is also a big part of this, and the artist in relation to, in a sense, how history's made was a big part of this as well. And there are a number of images of that taking place in these different little comparisons. And that concludes my presentation today. I don't know if there... questions or comments?
Yep, we have time for a couple questions, so
Tomatoes.
just wait for a mic, please, for recording.
All right, thank you. It's great that you're here. It's so neat that you can answer our questions. I am a docent at the museum, and I've been talking about Gallows Composite C since last August. And so I do the best I can, but I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. I was wondering if you would say that that's a critique of capital punishment, or would you say it's a critique of hanging?
That's a good question. Actually, hanging is the best way to die, it turns out. And there's a gallows in there, which represents the last death by hanging in the United States, which was in 96 or 95 in Delaware. Mm-hmm. And at that time, they had a choice. You could choose your method, lethal injection or hanging. And the prisoner, chose hanging because he knew that that's actually the most painless way to die.
So would you say it's a critique of capital punishment then?
Well, I would say it's not a critique so much as a way of opening a dialogue about it, or a discourse about it, or a discussion maybe. You know, particularly on the work that was finally built at scale, where you have a sort of platform for people to have a look, have an experience, and talk to each other about it. And that's,
right.
It's more about that kind of discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, one more quick question. I think one of the hangings was Saddam Hussein, and there's no beam structure. I mean, there's 3 beam structures, mm-hmm. and Saddam Hussein's hanging doesn't have one of those things. It has a thing in the ceiling.
That's right.
So is that why there's only 3?
Yeah, because they put a bolt in the ceiling. Yeah, exactly. Very observant. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, they botched his execution. I mean, the British had and they still use it in places like Singapore. It's called the table of drops, and it's the mathematical calculations based on the prisoner's weight, how much rope you need, and how long the drop should be. So they have to do. Each person has to have. You have to have the certain length of drop. If it's too short, it doesn't break your neck, and if it's too long, it like rips your head off, which is what happened to Saddam Hussein. I know it's a little grisly, but it's amazing. I mean, this book that was written in the 19th century is still used in many countries that still have capital punishment. Anyway.
You work a lot with found imagery. Is there a particular reason why you choose to transfer it to the medium of like drawing?
Yeah, why render the archival images as drawings as opposed to as prints or whatever, photographs? Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think there's a number of different reasons. One of them is making maybe a simple point, but kind of underscoring the idea that this is a very subjective image. First it started as a kind of challenge to the authenticity and the authority of the image itself as a kind of fact of history. And I thought, even if I reprint it and put a new text with it and everything, it still carries that material connotation. If you make a drawing of it, it's kind of erased. It's totally subjective. How do you know? It's all totally up for grabs, what's real and what isn't. But I think there's other things too. The idea of the labor in relation, again, the presence of the hand as opposed to the mechanical aspect of it. I think adds a level of complication to the way you see it. And also it, you know, early on, I also found that it was another very practical thing is that audiences, viewers, were much more interested in looking at the image and thinking about the content of the image as a drawing than they were as a photo. People just would tend to, and it's not a criticism, but I think, you know, you see a lot of photographs. And so when you see the drawing, it's a little more interesting. There's visual material there that draws you in a little more. So, you know, I think it's sort of a lot of different things. And then it's, you know, sort of become a mode that I use now in relation to the archival images. I mean, some of the things in Japan were not drawn; they were actually prints. So it really just depends, I guess, too, on what it is. It seemed like the printing idea had more to do also with the situation in Japan than the drawings. You know. Oh, yeah, there was one of those little cartoon speakers, yeah, from the PowerPoint, which never works. So I just stopped trying. But I guess it's still there, yeah. There was a sound component where if you had your smartphone, you could, you know, that thing where you get the code or whatever, and then you can listen. It was a prisoner in Louisiana who's since been released, actually, Herman Wallace, reading a poem about Frantz Fanon. And he was part of this group called the Angola Three that were wrongly imprisoned. He spent like 30 plus years on death row and solitary confinement. And he was their case, and I never met him, but their case, along with some other people and activists that worked on their case, was influential in the work. And so they let me use that, his reading that he did on the phone of reading that poem, so you could hear that, yeah. But you know, the technical thing, it never works. It's very powerful. But maybe when they do install it at the Walker, we'll be able to redo that. But I'm a bit ambivalent about that as well, because I think really the point is to go up on that platform without really knowing what it is and have the experience of either figuring it out, discovering it, or having a general sense of it and just, you know, thinking about the issues. You know, it was interesting because I tried for many years to find a place to do it in the United States, unsuccessfully. It's a tough one to raise money for. And then the opportunity to do it in Germany came up, and I thought, oh, this is stupid. Why should I do something about American history in Germany? This doesn't make any sense. But then I thought, well, maybe if we do it in Europe, American institutions or funders or whatever might think, okay, you know, maybe this is interesting. We could do it in the U.S. And actually, what I found was that it opened a lot of doors for the German public to talk about. You know, there's a lot of work, obviously, in Documenta and many other exhibitions in Germany about the Holocaust and about, you know, the whole issue. And the Germans, you know, deal with that very directly in those works. And what I found in this work is that actually, like, by thinking about somebody else's problems it opened a door in a way for them to think about their own issues. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And that's what I heard a lot from the tour guides who were taking people through the exhibition, and really thousands of people saw it. I think almost nearly 1 million people, and it's primarily the German public that goes to it. And they were really, overall, there was really, the reports I got were you know, that it provided almost like a safe space that wasn't too confrontational. And that was you know, I mean, it should be obvious. Other people's problems are so interesting and easy to deal with compared to our own, you know? So, yeah, that sort of distancing aspect was really quite interesting. So I don't know, when it gets put up here in Minneapolis, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Maybe it'll backfire. People will just reject it out of hand as being too close or too difficult or something. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. You know, he did the speech in the train station. You know, the artist Janet Cardiff and George Burris Miller did an amazing installation there where, you know, the trains, because so many of the trains left for the camps, and it's like, I'm getting goosebumps right now just remembering that, you know. And that's, yeah, he did the speech there in Castle at the train station. Yeah, really chilling. It came together, and I worked with Carolyn Christoph Bakargiev, the curator, who was very, I have to give her a lot of credit because she really pushed for me to do the piece, and she found that site and said, this is where you should do it, look at where this is, and she was right. And, you know, that's a big, I mean, you know, I'm someone I like the input from curators. I like to hear what people have to say, because especially when they know the situation, when I don't, it's great. So she was terrific and really understood. Also, I think she understood this idea that even though this is about American history, it also connects to everybody else's history. And that was interesting. Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's very dark. Yeah, exactly, yes. More humane as a, yeah, yeah. The mass genocide, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's, man, very heavy.
On that note, thank you all for joining us this evening, and please join me in thanking Sam.
Thank you.